Let's talk now to former British Commander Richard Kemp, live from Miami. Richard, you do get around. It's great to have you here on Outsiders, where you belong. Now, lots to talk about. We want to talk about, first of all, we had Natasha Hausdorff on earlier talking about the ICC and the disgraceful thing that's happening there with Netanyahu. So I want to get into that in a second. But first of all, I just wanted to ask you about Donald Trump's idea of court-martialing everybody involved in the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal. What do you make of that as a military man yourself?
Well, I wouldn't support that. I think undoubtedly there were horrific misjudgments made which had significant strategic effect on the United States and on Western democracies overall. But I think they were acting under the direction of the President of the United States, and I think it's he that, if anyone, he's actually already been court-martialed, found guilty, and dismissed from the government. So he's, in a way, taken it for that and
by his own party, exactly.
By his own party, but
and his follow-up by the people of America. Yes, exactly.
Exactly. I think they expressed their disapproval of that and other actions by him very effectively earlier this month. But I think that the reality is that many misjudgments were made by military people in the way this was conducted. But I don't think there's any grounds for saying, let's say, that they deliberately acted against the interests of the United States. I think it's an unfortunate aspect of the policies of the Biden government rather than deliberate military abuse of any sort.
Well, I think he had the generals in mind, and they tend to be more politicians anyway. But let's have a quick look at Netanyahu's response to the International Criminal Court, a bunch of grifters over there in Europe on the public purse, issuing an arrest warrant for the Prime Minister of Israel. Here's the Prime Minister's response.
The anti-Semitic decision of the International Court in The Hague is a modern Dreyfus trial, and it will end the same way. 130 years ago, the French Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of treason by a biased French court.
Richard Kemp, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a biased court that has not only stepped outside its remit in doing this and its jurisdiction, but it's twisted every aspect of its own charter to bring this about. Just as an example, I mean, the state of Palestine does not exist. It's a fiction. It may be an aspiration, but it's certainly not a genuine state. And you cannot be a member state of the ICC unless you're a state. And yet somehow the ICC has allowed the state of Palestine. Not only that, it's defined its boundaries. It has to define its boundaries to determine where alleged offences were committed. That's been a matter of international discussion and negotiation for decades, yet the ICC came up with their own conclusion. The ICC cannot try cases where there's a country concerned that's able to, has the judiciary itself and the political will to carry out its own trials. That's part of the principle of complementarity, which is a founding principle of the ICC. Ignored. Israel is a country that can do it itself. It's also ignored an international treaty, the Oslo Accords, in which the Palestinian Authority agreed under an international treaty to not to have legal jurisdiction over Israeli citizens. Yet somehow, on their behalf, the ICC has taken that jurisdiction. So those are jurisdictional issues which are very serious, which nothing like this has ever been done before. No democracy has ever come under scrutiny in this way by the ICC. Arrest warrants have not been issued for any other democratic country. I'm sure we're probably not got a lot of time, but the basis for the charges are completely unfounded. One charge of starvation, another charge of deliberate killing, unlawful killing, both completely without evidence, without foundation. Nothing the ICC said suggests any real evidence of either of those charges.
James.
And just on this whole idea of Palestinian sovereignty, we had the Australia vote the other day, in favor of some form of Palestinian sovereignty. But this whole idea of the two-state solution now, this has to be, understood now as a complete pipe dream, because who are we dealing with? There's nobody to deal with that's not Hamas, not terrorists at this point. I mean, don't we need to inject some realism with the people who would want to be going down that road on this? Who are we dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, the two-state solution was a fiction from the beginning, really. It was never a possibility. And that was partly, not entirely, but partly because the Palestinian people and their politicians don't want a two-state solution. They've rejected a two-state solution repeatedly over the decades. So even if we all yearn for a two-state solution, certainly the Palestinians don't want it. How do you achieve it if that's the case? But since the 7th of October, it's become absolutely ridiculous. There was a two-state solution of sorts before the 7th of October. You had Gaza, an independent entity, left by Israel to govern itself. And look what happened. That was the two-state solution. And that would be the outcome of any two-state solution, which included Judea and Samaria. And you mentioned Hamas. Let's not forget, the Palestinian Authority themselves are equally opposed to Israel as Hamas are. They hate Israel. They want Israel gone. They want one state, and that's an Islamic state in the land of Israel.
Rita.
In Montreal in recent days, we've seen the most shocking protests, the pro-Palestinian mobs attacking people, causing all sorts of damage and violence in downtown Montreal. There's been several arrests. How do you see the ongoing protests in the West? They are not dampening down, they're doubling down. And there seems to just be this flood of anti-Semitism that is very bold and unashamed now coming from the left.
Yeah, and let's not forget the Jew hunts in Amsterdam only a few days ago. Another example of the horrific anti-Jewish, anti-Israel sentiments among many people. I wouldn't say in any way a majority, but a significant minority of people on our streets. And it's fueled by the governments, and it's fueled by things like, the British government, the Canadian government saying in response to the ICC arrest warrant, we will arrest Prime Minister Netanyahu if he comes to our country. That adds fuel to the fire of these protests because, of course, if you're going to arrest him, it's because he's a war criminal. And that's very, very greedily and hungrily lapped up by these crowds to incite more violence. And it's irresponsible on the part of people like Justin Trudeau and Keir Starmer in the UK to effectively what they're doing is inciting violence. They may not be doing it deliberately, but they are actually inciting violence against their Jewish populations in their country.
And Richard, I'll jump in there. I think you may or may not be aware of Woollahra, the suburb of Sydney, that had vandalism, slogans, Jew hatred slogans the other day. We've had the Penny Wong, the Australian Foreign Minister, denying the entry into this country of Ayelet Shaked, who's a former justice minister in the Israeli government. What sort of a message does this send out? It says to me that the Australian government, the Australian Labor government of Albanese and Penny Wong, seems to be far more on the side of the terrorists, the Hamas and that mob, than it is on the side of the people, the Jewish people of Australia and the Jews of Israel, if it's constantly supporting one side against the other. Is that the message that people are getting?
It's a very clear message, and it's, you have to look at the Australian government with contempt when you see that they're willing to allow people associated with Hamas, directly associated with Hamas, to have visas to enter Israel. And they've allowed
to enter Australia.
I beg your pardon, to Australia. And they've allowed Palestinians from Gaza to come into Australia when there's every probability that they are associated themselves with Hamas, yet they won't allow in a politician from a Western democracy. So it's not just showing that they side with the Hamas terrorists over a democratic state, but it's also showing, as I said before about Britain and Canada, it's incitement. These kind of measures, banning an Israeli politician from coming to Israel. What does that tell you? Why would you ban them? Because they're trouble. And that's incitement, and it fuels the flames of the anti-Jew and anti-Israel hatred that's taken hold in all of our countries, including Australia, I'm afraid to say.
Colonel Richard Kemp, always great to chat to you. Thanks so much. And I couldn't agree with you more on those sentiments you've expressed there. That's Colonel Richard Kemp from Miami. Always got his finger on the pulse of what is happening there in the Middle East.